The Long Road Home, a story of the Civil War. Chapter 1. The Empty Chair. Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, June 1863. The corn was still knee-high when Elias Hoover noticed his father was gone. He had known it before his mother spoke the words, before the letter from the army arrived with its careful official hand. He had known it the way you know a storm is coming before the sky has done anything at all, by the quality of the silence, by the way the farm breathed differently without Samuel Hoover in it. Elias was 12 years old. He was not tall for his age, but he was lean and hard from 2 years of doing a man's work while that man was away fighting. His hands were calloused. His eyes, gray-green like the creek in October, had grown watchful. The other boys in the township still played soldiers in the cornfields. Elias did not play. His mother Ruth read the letter twice at the kitchen table before she set it down. The letter said that Samuel Hoover, Private 79th Pennsylvania Infantry, had gone missing following action near Chancellorsville in early May. Missing, not dead, the Army was careful to say that. But not found either. Not coming home on a stretcher with a wound that could be nursed. Simply gone, the way a stone disappears into dark water. "They'll find him," Elias said. His mother looked at him across the table. She was a plain woman made beautiful by the light she carried in her face, and now that light was very low, turned down like a lamp to save oil. "Perhaps," she said. His younger sister Clara, who was 8, cried quietly in the corner by the stove, her face turned to the wall so no one would see. The baby, Thomas, too young to understand, banged a wooden spoon on the floor in the cheerful, ignorant way of infants. That night, Elias lay in his narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about his father. He thought about the way Samuel sang off-key while he plowed, and how he never seemed embarrassed by it. He thought about the smell of his father's coat pipe tobacco and hay, and something particular to him alone, some warmth that Elias had no word for but would know anywhere. He thought about the last time he had seen him, standing at the end of the lane with his knapsack, turning back once to raise his hand. In the morning, before his mother was awake, Elias went to the barn and saddled the old mule, Patience, and loaded a canvas bag with dried beef, 2 apples, a folded blanket, and the $4 he had been saving since the previous harvest. He wrote his mother a note, "Gone to find Papa. Don't worry, I will come back," and propped it against the salt box where she would see it. Then he walked Patience quietly down the lane past the sleeping house and the sleeping fields and the stone wall his grandfather had built, and turned north. He did not know exactly where he was going. He knew his father's regiment had been fighting in Virginia, but that was a long way south, and the rumors coming back up the roads said the Confederates were moving north. Men at the mill talked in low voices about Lee and his army crossing the Potomac, about invasion, about the war coming to Pennsylvania itself. Elias thought, if the war is coming here, maybe my father is coming with it. It was not a sound plan. He understood that, dimly. But it was the only plan he had. Chapter 2. The Roads of War. The Pike North, late June 1863. The roads were unlike anything Elias had ever seen. He had been as far as Lancaster City twice, once for market day, once when his father took him to see a train, and the roads then had been ordinary country roads, rutted and dusty in summer, churned to mud in spring. These roads were something else altogether. They were rivers of men. Soldiers moved in both directions. Union troops marching north and west in long blue columns, supply wagons grinding behind them. And in the other direction, the steady trickle of refugees, farm families with their goods piled in carts, women with small children walking beside, old men driving cattle they refused to leave behind. There were sutlers with wagons of goods. There were newspaper men on horseback. There were rumors, 1,000 rumors, drifting from mouth to mouth. Lee is at Harrisburg. Lee is at York. Lee has 100,000 men. Lee is heading straight for Philadelphia. Elias moved among them on Patience, who bore the chaos with the philosophic patience her name suggested. Soldiers glanced at him and looked away. A boy on a mule in these times was unremarkable. There were farm boys everywhere, drawn by curiosity or errand or necessity. On the second day, a sergeant in a passing column reined in and studied Elias with narrowed eyes. "Where you headed, boy?" "Looking for my father, 79th Pennsylvania. He went missing at Chancellorsville. The sergeant was a broad, weathered man with a beard going gray at the edges. Something shifted in his face. 79th's up ahead somewhere, with Doubleday's division last I knew. He paused. You shouldn't be on these roads, son. Something big is building. Can't say where or when, but you'll know it when it starts. I'll know it when it starts, Elias agreed. The sergeant shook his head, clicked his tongue, and rode on. That night, Elias made camp in a meadow already thick with soldiers. He sat at the edge of a fire that was not his and ate his dried beef and listened to the men talk. They talked about home farms and wives, mothers and sweethearts and cold beer, and the particular way certain rivers looked in August. They were afraid, Elias understood, and so they talked about everything except what was ahead. He understood this impulse. He had been doing the same thing for days, thinking about anything except what he might find when he found his father or didn't. "Where you from, boy?" asked a young soldier across the fire. He could not have been more than 17 himself. "Lancaster County." "Mennonite?" "No, my father volunteered." The soldier nodded slowly. "What's his name?" "Samuel Hoover, 79th Infantry." No one around the fire knew the name, but they passed it along anyway, soldier to soldier into the dark, the way names always traveled in war, hopefully, uselessly, into silence. On the fourth day, Elias began to hear the guns. It was not like thunder, though people always said it was like thunder. It was lower than thunder, more patient, with no pause between the rumbles, only a continuous muttering that seemed to come from the earth itself rather than the sky. He could feel it in his chest before he was sure he heard it with his ears. Patience did not like it. She moved with her ears laid back, and Elias spent considerable effort keeping her on the road as the other travelers pushed past. A man walking beside a wagon saw him struggling and called up, "That's Gettysburg, boy, town up ahead. They have been fighting since morning." Gettysburg. The name meant nothing to Elias. It was just a small town in Adams County, a crossroads, the kind of place that existed everywhere and nowhere. But the guns spoke in its direction with such authority that he understood even then that it was becoming something else, that its name was being written in something that would not wash off. Chapter 3. The Drummer Boy. Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, the 1st of July, 1863. He smelled the battle before he saw it. It was the smell of burnt powder, sharp and chemical, unlike anything from ordinary life mixed with the smell of horses, and under that, something else that Elias would not identify until later. When he was older, when he understood what it was, the copper iron smell of blood in quantity. The road into Gettysburg was clogged with men and horses moving in every direction. A chaos that seemed total until you looked carefully and saw it was the chaos of purpose. Men who knew what they were doing even if no one watching could see the pattern. Elias dismounted and led Patience by the bridle, pushing through the crowd. He was near the edge of the town when he nearly tripped over the boy. He was perhaps 13, this boy about Elias's own age, and he was sitting with his back against a stone wall with his legs straight out in front of him. His drum lay on its side in the road. He was pale as creek clay, and there was blood soaking through the left arm of his uniform jacket, and his eyes were glassy with pain. "Hey," said Elias. He knelt down. "Hey, are you—" "I'm all right," the boy said, in the automatic way of soldiers who are not all right. Then, almost immediately, "I'm not all right." "Where's your regiment?" "Up there." He jerked his chin vaguely toward the sound of the guns. "They need the drum. They need someone to—" He stopped and closed his eyes. "I can't hold it." Elias looked at the drum. It was a standard infantry drum, a rope-tension snare with a pair of sticks tucked through the carrying strap. He had never played a drum in his life. He had watched the company drummer march through Lancaster in '61, when the regiments were forming, had studied the complex patterns the boy played, and thought them impossibly difficult. "What's your regiment?" Elias asked. "2nd Wisconsin, Meredith's brigade." The wounded boy opened his eyes. "You know the long roll? I can learn it. It's just a roll. Just keep rolling when they need to advance. And the recall is—" He tapped a simple pattern on the ground with his good hand. "That's the recall. That's the most important one." Elias looked at the drum. He looked up the road toward the smoke rising over the town. He thought, "I came to find my father." He thought, his regiment might be up there. He thought, This is not what I planned." He picked up the drum. "What's your name?" the wounded boy asked. "Elias." "Mine's Thomas. Thomas Alcott." He paused. "Tell them Tom Alcott sent you. They'll know me." "I'll tell them," Elias said, and slung the drum strap over his shoulder. Nothing in his life had prepared him for what was on the other side of that road. The fields north and west of Gettysburg had been turned into something from a nightmare, not the neat, distant nightmares of stories and imagination, but the close, specific, overwhelming nightmare of actual things. He saw men he could not look at directly. He saw a horse standing in a field with no rider, and no apparent reason to be standing, and only gradually realized that the horse was dead and had simply not yet fallen. He saw a wall of smoke that smelled of sulfur and burnt grass, and the summer underneath it incongruously sweet. The men of the 2nd Wisconsin took him without much ceremony. In a battle, an extra pair of hands is an extra pair of hands, and the drum was what they needed, and Elias had the drum. "You know the long roll?" asked a lieutenant, speaking very quickly. "Yes, sir." "Then roll it when I tell you. Don't stop unless I say stop, or you hear the recall. If you hear the recall from elsewhere, echo it. Understand?" "Yes, sir." "Good lad." The lieutenant looked at him for half a second with an expression Elias could not read, something between respect and sorrow, and then turned back to the battle. Elias rolled the drum. He rolled it through the afternoon heat, through the smoke that made his eyes run, through the noise that stopped being individual sounds and became one enormous physical presence pressing against him from all sides. He did not think about what he was seeing. He could not. He narrowed himself down to the drum, to the rhythm, to the patterns Tom Alcott had tapped on the ground, and he played them until his arms ached and his palms bled and the light began to change. Chapter 4. Sergeant Calhoun. Gettysburg, July 1-2, 1863. His name was Ezra Calhoun, and he was 41 years old, which in 1863 made him ancient by the standards of the Army. He was a big man, not tall but wide, with a face so weathered by sun and wind that it looked carved from the side of a barn. He had a gray beard he kept trimmed short, and eyes of a dark, comfortable brown that reminded Elias, inexplicably, of his grandfather's old setter dog, patient, intelligent, and capable of great kindness. He was a sergeant in the 6th Wisconsin, a companion regiment to the 2nd, and he had been in the Army since the very beginning of the war. He found Elias on the evening of July 1st, after the Union forces had been pushed back through the town and onto Cemetery Hill, where they were now digging in and looking back over the ground they had lost in the terrible fighting of that afternoon. Elias was sitting on the ground with his back against a stone wall, still holding the drum, staring at nothing. He was not crying. He was past crying. He was in that place beyond emotion that has no name, where the mind goes when it has seen too much to hold. "Boy," he looked up. "You the drummer from the 2nd? "I was. I'm not actually in the Army." Calhoun sat down heavily beside him. He took a flask from his coat, drank, and offered it. Elias shook his head. Calhoun put it away. "What are you doing here then?" "Looking for my father, 79th Pennsylvania. He went missing at Chancellorsville." Calhoun was quiet for a moment. "79th's with the 1st Corps somewhere. Couldn't tell you more than that." He looked at the drum. "You play well, for someone who had no business being up there." "I had no idea what I was doing," Elias said. "Nobody does, the first time." Calhoun clasped his big hands around his knees. "Where are you from?" "Lancaster County." "Hoover? How did you know?" "Half of Lancaster County's named Hoover." He almost smiled. "My wife is from Ephrata. I know the county." Something loosened very slightly in Elias's chest at this, the idea that this enormous, smoky, terrible world contained a thread connecting this man to the fields he knew, to the stone walls and the bend of the Conestoga, to home. "You can't go looking for your father tonight," Calhoun said. "Tonight you stay with us. Tomorrow." He paused, and the pause was careful, measured, a man not making promises he might not be able to keep. "Tomorrow we'll see what we can find out." "Thank you," Elias said. "Don't thank me yet," Calhoun said. "It's going to get worse before it gets better. You understand that?" "Yes, sir." "Don't call me sir. I work for a living." He stayed with Calhoun's mess through the night and through the terrible 2nd day of July. July 2nd was worse than the 1st, longer, louder. with fighting that seemed to erupt simultaneously in a dozen different places across miles of rolling Pennsylvania farmland. Elias learned the names of those places in the days and months afterward: Little Round Top, Devil's Den, the Peach Orchard, the Wheat Field, the Slaughter Pen. Names that would carry weight for the rest of his life, that he would hear mentioned in hushed voices in church or at the store and feel the sound of them like a fist against the sternum. During that day, Calhoun kept him close. The drum work was less formal now. The fluid, terrible mechanics of the battle had moved beyond the point where drum signals controlled much of anything, but Elias stayed near the line, passing messages, carrying water to the wounded, doing the thousand small tasks that a willing pair of hands could accomplish in a battle's wake. Calhoun watched over him with the unself-conscious protectiveness of a man who had perhaps lost people he loved and did not intend to lose another one if he could help it. Between engagements, in the brief lulls that the battle offered, they talked. "Do you have children?" Elias asked during one such lull. "Had," Calhoun said. "Then, a daughter. Fever 2 winters ago. She was 10. I'm sorry." Her name was Grace. Calhoun said the name with great care, as though it were fragile. She liked to read. She read everything she could get her hands on. She was going to be something, that girl. The gun started up again somewhere to the south, and the conversation ended, and they did not return to it, but Elias carried it with him, the name, the specificity of it, the image of a girl who liked to read as though it were something he'd been asked to hold. That night, in the uneasy quiet after the second day's fighting, Elias found the 79th Pennsylvania's bivouac and went through it name by name, tent by tent, asking for Samuel Hoover. No one knew him. A few remembered the name from Chancellorsville. Yes, there was a Hoover, tall fellow, quiet, had a farm somewhere in Lancaster County, but after Chancellorsville? After the retreat across the river? Nobody knew. He came back to Calhoun's fire and sat down and said nothing. Calhoun handed him a piece of hardtack and said nothing either, and that was exactly right. Chapter 5. Pickett's Charge. Gettysburg, the 3rd of July, 1863. The third day began with silence. Not the silence of peace, but the held-breath silence of something enormous gathering itself. The men felt it. They moved with a strange stillness, as though any sudden sound might set off what was coming. Elias watched them clean their rifles for the third time, write letters they tucked into their breast pockets in case they did not survive to send them. Calhoun was writing such a letter himself when Elias came to sit beside him. "To your wife?" Elias asked. "Yes." Calhoun folded the paper without looking up. "A man should write these letters more often, shouldn't wait until he needs one. What do you say in them?" Calhoun thought about it. "I say what I should have said when I had the chance to say it out loud." He tucked the letter away. "That's the tragedy of these things. You figure out what matters when it's too late to act on it." They sat in silence for a while. "Do you think my father is alive?" Elias asked. Calhoun looked at him steadily. This was one of the things Elias had come to value about the man. He did not offer false comfort. He took questions seriously and gave them serious answers. "I don't know," Calhoun said. "Missing means a lot of things. Sometimes it means dead in a place no one found him. Sometimes it means prisoner. Sometimes it means he got turned around in the confusion and ended up with a different regiment and the paperwork hasn't caught up. War is chaos, boy. Chaos has a habit of losing people and then finding them again. But sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it doesn't." Elias nodded. He appreciated the honesty more than any reassurance would have been. He was 12, but the last 4 days had been doing something to him, filing down the soft edges of childhood, leaving something harder and quieter in their place. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the Confederate artillery opened up. There are no words adequate to the sound of 160 Confederate cannon firing in concert across open Pennsylvania farmland. Elias had thought, after the first 2 days, that he understood what artillery sounded like. He did not. This was different in kind, not degree of physical assault, a reorganization of the world, a sound so enormous it seemed to compress the air itself and leave no room for anything else. He pressed himself against the stone wall and covered his head with his arms and waited. For 2 hours the Confederate guns fired and the Union guns answered, and the smoke over the ridge became so thick it blotted the afternoon sun, and the ground shook without ceasing. Men around Elias prayed. some aloud and some silently. Some stared ahead, some wept without apparent shame. Then the Confederate guns fell silent. Then, across the open fields to the west, a mile wide and half a mile deep, 13,000 Confederate soldiers stepped out of the tree line and began to walk toward them. Elias rose to look. Beside him, Calhoun rose too, and up and down the line men rose to look. And there was a moment, just a moment of absolute silence, in which everyone on both sides seemed to pause and apprehend what was about to happen. "Lord have mercy," someone near Elias whispered. Then the Union guns opened up, and the world ended again. Elias rolled the drum. He did not know when he had picked it up. He did not know why. He only knew that his hands were moving, and the rhythm was coming. And somewhere in the terrible noise, perhaps, it was doing some small good, holding the line together by a note, steadying some trembling hand by a beat, reminding the men of something human in the mechanical roar of the killing. He rolled it through the advance of the Confederate line, and through the Union infantry's volley fire, and through the smoke and screaming that rose as Pickett's men hit the Union position. He rolled it until his arms were rubber, and his voice, though he hadn't known he was using it, was hoarse from shouting words he could not afterwards recall. He was rolling it when Ezra Calhoun was hit. It happened quickly, the way the worst things always do. A Confederate soldier had broken through the line, one of perhaps 100 who reached the Union wall before being driven back, and Calhoun stepped forward to meet him. And there was a pistol shot from somewhere in the smoke, and Calhoun sat down hard on the ground with a look of surprise that Elias would remember for the rest of his life. Elias dropped the drum and was at his side in an instant. "Easy," Calhoun said. "Easy now." "Where are you hit?" "Chest, right side." He touched the place. Not the left, so maybe. He stopped and took a careful breath. It may be all right. It was not all right. Elias could see that. But he pressed his folded jacket against the wound and held it there. And he talked to Calhoun the way Calhoun had talked to him, not with false comfort, but with presence, with the simple acknowledgement, "I am here, and I see you, and you are not alone." "Write to my wife," Calhoun said. "I will. Tell her about Grace. Tell her I was thinking about Grace." "I'll tell her." Around them, the battle was ending. Pickett's charge had broken. The Confederate men were retreating across the open field, and the Union line was still standing, and men were beginning to comprehend that they had held, that the great, terrible gamble had been made and lost, and the war's tide had turned right here, on this ordinary Pennsylvania ground. Elias did not think about any of this. He sat with Calhoun and talked about Lancaster County, about the Conestoga River and the way it looked in summer, about the smell of fresh-cut hay, about the particular quality of light in those long August evenings when everything turned gold. He talked until Calhoun's breathing became very slow and even, and then simply stopped. He sat with him a while longer then, in the settling quiet of a battle that had finished. Chapter 6. After Gettysburg, the 4th of July, 1863. He spent July 4th searching. The battlefield in the aftermath of the fighting was a country unto itself, a ruined country with its own terrible geography, its own population of the lost and the found and the in-between. The fields that had been farms 3 days ago were something else now. The smell was indescribable. Elias moved through it with the systematic determination of someone who has decided that the only way to endure an intolerable thing is to keep moving. He asked after Samuel Hoover at every aid station, every regimental bivouac he could locate. He walked the length of Cemetery Ridge and down into the town and out the other side. He described his father to surgeons and privates and chaplains and prisoners being marched to the rear. Tall man, 40 years old, gray in the beard, a farmer's build, a calm way of talking. Blue eyes, a scar on his right hand from a reaping hook. Nobody knew him. Nobody could place him. In the chaos of the reorganizing army, one chaplain, a tired man with round spectacles, sat with Elias for a few minutes on the steps of a church being used as a hospital. "Missing from Chancellorsville, you say?" "Since May. That's 2 months." The chaplain removed his spectacles and polished them thoughtfully. "A man missing 2 months in this war has likely found his way somewhere. Prison camp, perhaps, if he was captured. A hospital under a different name, if he was confused or injured. The records are, he paused, choosing his word carefully, imperfect. But he might be alive. He might be alive, the chaplain agreed, and something in the way he said it made Elias understand that this was not just comfort, but genuine possibility that the world remained open, that the worst had not been confirmed. It was not enough, but it was something. He found Patience where he'd tethered her 2 days earlier, alive and unhappy, and gave her the last of his dried beef as an apology. He found Tom Alcott's drum where he had dropped it when Calhoun fell, and he stood over it for a long time. Then he picked it up and brought it back to the 2nd Wisconsin surgeon and said, "This belongs to Tom Alcott, Private Alcott of the 2nd. Is he, was he?" "Alcott's alive," the surgeon said, not looking up from what he was doing. "Arm saved. He'll be back in 3 months if the wound don't sour." Elias set the drum down gently and walked away before anyone could see his face. He sat on a fence rail at the edge of the battlefield and looked out over the fields and let everything that had been dammed up since he left home move through him. He did not try to stop it. He cried for Ezra Calhoun and for his father and for the men he had watched fall and for Tom Alcott's arm and for Grace Calhoun, who liked to read and was 10 years old when she died. He cried for his mother sitting at the kitchen table with that letter. He cried for Clara turned toward the wall and for baby Thomas who did not know what had been lost. He cried until there was nothing left to cry with, and then he climbed down from the fence rail and mounted Patience and turned her south. Chapter 7. The Road South, Pennsylvania, July 1863. The road south was different from the road north. The road north had been urgent, purposeful, lit by a 12-year-old certainty that a problem had a solution, and the solution was motion. The road south was slower. Elias had no urgency left in him. He rode Patience at her own pace and let the miles come and go as they would. He passed through small towns where people stood on their porches and watched the retreating columns with the glazed expressions of those who have been living inside a catastrophe and are only now beginning to understand that it is over, or this part of it anyway. Women waved. Some handed bread and apples up to soldiers as they passed. One old man stood at the edge of the road with his hat off, his white head bowed, as though the army were a funeral. Perhaps it was, Elias thought. In part. He thought about what he was going home to, his mother's face when she saw him, the conversation they would have to have about his father, what he had found out, which was almost nothing, and what he had seen, which was too much. He did not know how to carry both of those things at once. He did not know how to tell his mother that he had searched and failed, without turning that failure into something final, when the chaplain had said, quite specifically, that it was not final. He practiced the words as he rode. "He's missing, but that doesn't mean dead. Missing means unknown. There are prisons and hospitals with imperfect records, and the war is large, and the record-keeping is chaos, and a man can be alive in the middle of all that, and nobody knows it yet." The words sounded thin when he said them out loud. He said them anyway. He would say them to his mother, and she would hear what she needed to hear in them, and the farm would go on. On the 3rd day of riding, the landscape resolved into something he knew. Not in an intellectual way he had known the road for miles, but in the bone-deep way of true homecoming, where the body recognizes a place before the mind confirms it. The particular angle of a ridge against the sky, the stand of oaks at the Brenneman farm, the smell of the creek, the specific quality of the light in Lancaster County, which was different from the light everywhere else, or seemed so, because it was the first light he had ever known. He urged Patience into a slow trot and came down the long hill that ended at the lane leading to the Hoover farm. He was a different person than the one who had ridden up this lane 11 days ago. He understood this without quite being able to articulate it. Something in him had been rearranged by what he had seen and done. The drum, the smoke, Calhoun, the great wave of men walking toward him across that open field. He was not older exactly, but he had been to the edge of something and looked over, and you could not unsee that. You carried it differently, afterward. He came around the last bend in the lane. He stopped. There was a man standing at the gate of the farm. He was thinner than Elias remembered, leaning on the gatepost as though the gate were holding him up rather than the other way around. His coat was wrong, not the blue Union coat, but a civilian coat, brown, too big in the shoulders. His beard was longer and going gray at the edges in a way Elias did not recognize. But he was tall, this man, and his hands on the gatepost were a farmer's hands, broad and calloused. And there was a scar on the right hand, from a reaping hook. For a moment, neither of them moved. Elias sat on patience, and the man stood at the gate, and the summer afternoon held them both in its golden, indifferent light. Then Samuel Hoover pushed himself away from the gate and took a step, and Elias swung down from the mule before she'd even fully stopped, and the distance between them closed. He did not ask, right away, where his father had been. There would be time for that. There would be long winter evenings by the stove for that, years of it gradually told, the whole story emerging the way things emerge from frozen ground in spring, slowly, piece by piece. He would learn that his father had been taken prisoner at Chancellorsville and held in a camp in Virginia, and that he had been exchanged in late June and put on a train north, and that he had walked the last 40 miles to the farm because he could not wait. He would learn all of this later. For now he stood in the lane with his face against his father's chest and listened to the heartbeat there, steady, real, undeniably alive, and felt something in him that had been very tightly wound since June began, very slowly to release. Behind them, the farmhouse door opened, and Clara was running down the lane screaming, "Papa, Papa, Papa," with the uncomplicated joy of 8 years old, and behind her came their mother, Ruth, walking quickly, one hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes already full. And old Patience stood in the lane and regarded all of it with the tranquility of a creature that has been through a great deal and intends to have some grass now. That night, after his father and mother had talked long into the dark, and Clara had fallen asleep clutching her father's sleeve, and baby Thomas had been passed back and forth like a small warm gift, Elias sat on the porch step alone. The stars were out, the same stars that had been over Gettysburg, over the fields of the dead and the drum, over Ezra Calhoun in his last minutes, over Tom Alcott with his arm and his life ahead of him. Stars do not distinguish between such places. They fall on everything equally. He had a letter to write. He had promised Calhoun. He thought about how to begin it. He thought about what Calhoun had said. You figure out what matters when it's too late to act on it. He went inside and found paper and sat down at the kitchen table. And his father came and stood beside him without asking why. And in that warm light, Elias Hoover, 12 years old, who had seen things that grown men could not unsee, put his pen to the paper and began to write. End.